Chapter 6, New Life. The first years of the Adjustment Center in Little Rock paralleled the era historians have called the Great Decade of expansion of services for the blind. Francis Kessler, in The Unseen Minority, wrote that few periods in history were as fertile as the 1950s in providing blind people with opportunities and incentives for economic and social progress, for expanded educational, vocational, and cultural programs, availability of jobs, and new resources for personal adjustment and growth. As early as 1951, I believed our facility had become a leader in that movement. That same year, we changed the Adjustment Center's name to the Southwest Rehabilitation Center for the Blind. Although the center was still sponsored by the Lions Clubs and operated by the Arkansas Enterprises for the Blind, I felt the new name more accurately reflected the regional nature of the facility. We had also received some criticism that Adjustment Center implied the people who came there were maladjusted. By the mid-1960s, we dropped Southwest from our name and became the Arkansas Enterprises for the Blind Rehabilitation Center, or more commonly, the AEB. No matter what name we used, I knew that the important things about the place was not the title on the door, but rather the daily activities to aid the blind that went on inside. During my tenure with the STAND program, I identified a few basic skills that I felt were essential for any newly blinded person to possess in order to function in a sighted world. These same skills became the core of our program at the center. While we always emphasized that each blind person is an individual with his own unique needs, we also stressed the mastery of the basic skills for each one of our trainees. The ability to move about independently, a skill referred to as orientation and mobility, has always been a fundamental need for every blind person. When an individual first loses his sight, the loss of the capacity to simply get up and go where he or she wants is a terrifying experience, one that leaves the stricken person with a total feeling of helplessness. I thought one of our own trainees expressed this sensation so well when he said, "You can be a foot away from where you want to be, and you're still lost." For many years, I taught orientation and mobility to almost all of our trainees. Using the grounds and walkways of the building, I instructed them in the proper technique of travel with the aid of a cane. Blind people always fear that they are about to step in a hole or stumble and fall. Like sighted people who awaken in the night and try to go through the house without turning on a light, blind people learn to creep in order to travel from place to place. Consequently, the basic idea of using a cane is to clear a pathway. After you step with your right foot, you use the cane to check where your left foot will be with the next step. The cane also informs the blind person of changes in the texture of the ground, such as a shift from grass to gravel or concrete. After several weeks, our trainees usually develop the confidence to travel with the head held erect and not slumped over in the creeping position. I also found that this self-reliance in independent travel quickly led to an increased confidence in the trainee's ability to do other tasks as well. In my lifetime, the most dramatic improvement in cane travel resulted from the work of Richard Hoover. A young physical education instructor, Hoover served at the Valley Forge Eye Hospital during World War II, where part of his assignment included helping orient blind patients to the hallways and teaching them independent travel. Out of this experience, he developed the Hoover technique of cane travel, which is the basic rhythm method used by almost all blind people today. Not only did he replace the old tapping system, but he also developed a longer and lighter cane, which improved travel for the blind. From this experience in orientation, Hoover went to medical school and became an ophthalmologist. After our first meeting at a conference in the late 1940s, Dr. Richard Hoover and I became friends, and I always enjoyed reminding him that the center in Little Rock also made a small contribution to the development of cane travel. One of our trainees, a former blacksmith, developed a system of manufacturing canes from solid Arkansas hickory. He covered the end of the cane with a small spring and hard metal tip, which lasted far longer than the old wood or rubber tips. We named the cane the Arkansas Traveler, and for many years it was one of the most popular canes in America. There is considerably more to orientation and mobility than cane travel. For example, we had to teach our trainees to locate items they had dropped on the floor. Many blind people have been injured by bending over and hitting their heads on a table or chair. One of the first things we taught in this regard involved protecting oneself by squatting down and carefully exploring the surrounding area for the lost object. After a trainee gained confidence in his ability to find nearby objects and travel around the grounds of the center, the next phase of training included learning to catch a bus, ride downtown, and visit various stores and businesses. During this training, we stressed the value of sounds and smells in helping a person travel. Locating a bakery, a flower shop, a barber shop, or even a bowling alley by relying on senses other than sight. In 1956, we began the practice of presenting a small winged cane pin to our trainees who successfully completed their downtown solo. This award has always been a great source of pride and symbol of growing self-reliance on the part of the blind people who trained at the center. As part of this solo training, we sometimes gave the individual the name and address of another blind person who worked in a downtown stand. Not only did locating these people help our trainees develop confidence, but meeting a blind person, many of whom were former trainees successfully working in the downtown area, also provided an important morale boost. As the director of the center, I always enjoyed being on hand when the trainees returned from their downtown solos with stories of their various experiences. Some of the most interesting of these anecdotes involved their encounters with insensitive sighted people. For instance, one fellow related a story of how he successfully traveled downtown, but while walking around, he began daydreaming, lost track of the streets, and did not know if he was standing on Louisiana Street or Center Street. He waited until he heard a man approach the corner and then asked, "Pardon me, sir, is this Louisiana?" The man stopped, assumed our trainee was a typical helpless blind man, and replied, "Oh no, friend, this is Arkansas." Another set of basic skills we believed all of our trainees should master involved the fundamental techniques of daily living. For the newly blinded individual, selecting the right tube or jar for grooming needs, going to the bathroom, or eating a meal at a formal dinner party are all activities filled with nightmarish possibilities. To instill confidence in these areas in our new trainees, we set aside a 45-minute period each day devoted exclusively to solving the problems of daily living: how to iron, how to grocery shop, how to mark canned goods for later use, how to use tape to color coordinate clothing, how to make a bed and care for a dorm room. Blind housewives, of course, needed to learn to cook again in order to regain their self-esteem. So after the first few years of the center's operation, we employed a full-time instructor in home economics. The instructor always began by orienting the blind housewife to the stove and other regular kitchen equipment. Years ago, the teacher marked the dials on the stove with dots of Elmer's glue, using the same principle as a Braille watch. After that, our instructors taught the trainees a variety of useful techniques to restore confidence in their ability to cook. For example, the trainees learned to measure liquids with special spoons with the handle bent at a 90-degree angle so the instrument could be dropped straight down into the liquid with a resulting level measure. To prepare an egg for breakfast, our instructors taught the trainees to use a ring cut from a tuna fish can in the center of the skillet as an easily located container for the egg. One of the most frustrating aspects of being blind is not blindness itself, but rather being forced to adjust to the sighted person's world. Wearing pleasing colors or the latest fashion has little meaning to a blind person, but from the beginning of our training program, we stressed the importance to the trainees of making that adjustment. We taught our female trainees to apply makeup by using a blending technique and measuring lotions by a single quick tilt of the bottle into the palm of the hand. We taught our male trainees to shave every morning using an electric razor and starting at one side of the face, making a series of concentric circles. The mastery of these personal grooming skills instilled in our trainees an important sense of self-assurance and independence. They learned that they did not have to be helpless and rely on sighted friends and relatives for their basic needs. A similar situation existed in regard to communication skills. In modern culture, the inability to read and write is equated with stupidity, and one of our first goals has always been to restore these skills as quickly as possible. One particular young man at the center some years ago had a master's degree, but underwent the embarrassment of being well educated, but having to sign his name with an X. After a few weeks at the center, he learned to use a tablet with line guides to enable him to write a legible signature. The restoration of this simple skill changed the young man's entire outlook and encouraged him to work harder at acquiring new capabilities. The core of our communications program included Braille and the use of a typewriter. Our trainees learned not only to read Braille, but also to write in Braille by using a slate and stylus technique. Although a few newly blinded adults never learn Braille well enough to read for recreation, they do learn enough to read and write simple notes or telephone numbers, which reduces their feelings of helplessness. Finally, for over 30 years, the staff at the center has fought a constant battle against the sense of isolation that affects so many of our clients. Many of the trainees had been active people before they became blind, but then had withdrawn from family, social, or even religious activities. To combat this situation, we introduced a recreational program to strengthen their social adjustment skills. We initiated card games such as bridge or pitch or even poker using Braille cards. We taught social dancing, bowling, and various parlor games. In the days before we could afford a recreational director, our regular staff volunteered to come back on Thursday evenings to lead the social activities. I recall numerous occasions when Bernice and I hosted special recreational evenings in our home. While we enjoyed these pleasant evenings, they also served to give our trainees the confidence that they could go into someone's home, participate in a game or other activity, share the refreshments, and enjoy the same social benefits as sighted people. We also found that exercise served a useful function in our overall recreational program. In the old Brack home, our tiny gym contained stationary bicycles, weights, a punching bag, and chinning bars. For years I held the honor of being the champion chinner. I used to challenge the new trainees to develop their muscles to be able to chin themselves as many times as I could. In addition to the other equipment, we had a walking machine that taught the trainees to abandon the short, choppy steps that so many blind people use and adopt long and purposeful strides. Like exercise, music often provided our trainees with a healthy recreational outlet. We encouraged all of our new people to continue any musical interests they may have had before they lost their sight, or, if possible, develop new interests in either listening to music or learning to play an instrument. I remember in 1961 we had an unusually talented group of trainees who organized a small combo to perform at events like the Sight Conservation Forum. The group included Bill Smith of Fort Smith on the saxophone and Bobby Long on lead guitar. Smith once played with the Smith Family Band on the Grand Ole Opry, and Long, who studied under the famous guitarist Chet Atkins, had played for recording artists like Brenda Lee. That winter, the little combo from the Rehabilitation Center played some of the best music heard in the entire state. A final recreational activity at the center involved some of the trainees' interest in becoming ham radio operators. Initially, I opposed the project since the radio equipment cost so much, but I went along with the idea because I thought using the radios might contribute to the development of trainees' communication skills. As events turned out, operating the transmitting equipment went beyond building basic skills. In 1966, the blind ham operators at the center made the Christmas season memorable for Arkansas servicemen in Vietnam and their families at home by enabling them to exchange messages across the ocean. 2 years later, an emergency team from the AEB provided communications at Jonesboro in northeast Arkansas after a tornado killed 34 people and destroyed large sections of the town. Finally, in 1970, when Hurricane Celia ripped through South Texas, the Red Cross declared the shortwave station at the center in Little Rock an emergency communications facility. For several days, teams of blind trainees worked on a 24-hour schedule to maintain communications with the devastated areas. As a result of their efforts, several lives were saved, and the whole experience provided all of our trainees with a marvelous example of sighted and blind people working side by side to accomplish important goals, the kind of world we hoped they would find after completing their training and leaving the center. We designed all of our programs, orientation and mobility, daily living techniques, communication skills, and recreational activities to help instill confidence in our trainees and prepare them to function in a sighted environment. None of these activities, however, could have succeeded without the hard work and dedication of the staff members who labored over the years to provide the best possible environment for our clients. Perhaps the most irreplaceable staff member from the beginning of the Adjustment Center has been Lila Lampkin, a native of Danville, Arkansas, and a graduate of Dauphin's Business College. Lila joined my staff as a secretary when I moved from the welfare department to the education department and worked on every step of the planning process that created the center. After I decided to join the volunteer agency as a paid employee, I knew I would need a secretary, so I invited Lila to come with me. Even though I pointed out she would be sacrificing a good deal in terms of retirement benefits, she chose to become part of the staff at the center anyway. From the beginning, Lila became personally involved in our work. She joined the American Association of Workers for the Blind and served as assistant secretary to the board of both the Arkansas Enterprises for the Blind and the Lions State Committee for Sight Conservation. After a few years, she was promoted to the position of administrative assistant. From that post, Lila seemed to know everything that went on at the center and anticipated a variety of needs and necessary actions. Knowing the difficulties we faced in the beginning, she also acted as a guardian against needless waste, turning off unused lights or saving supplies whenever possible. Many times I had to force her to take a long overdue vacation, and when I retired in 1978, Lila remained as the administrative assistant to the two directors that followed me. I sometimes wonder if the center would have turned out as it did without Lila's loyal and dedicated service. Another important staff member who played a key role in the development of the center was Oliver H. Burke. Oliver had been a bookkeeper and accountant before entering the Army during World War II. Wounded by artillery fire near Aachen, Germany, he returned to the United States with a severe visual handicap. I first heard about him in the spring of 1951 when he was completing his bachelor's degree at the University of Central Arkansas, then called Arkansas State Teachers College. I recruited him to come to work at the center and personally trained him in orientation and mobility. Oliver had never been around blind people, but almost immediately became enthusiastic about our work. After a short time, I made him our first full-time orientation and mobility instructor. At first, I assumed he planned eventually to enter administrative or supervisory work at the center, but Oliver told me one day that he felt his most important contribution would be as a mobility teacher. He had discovered an occupation at which he excelled and wanted to continue the work he enjoyed. He stayed with us for over 25 years, and when he retired, I would guess Oliver Burke had taught more blind people independent travel than any other person in the world. In January 1951, I escorted a group of trainees to the movie Bright Victory, starring Arthur Kennedy and Peggy Dow. There is a powerful scene in the film when the recently blinded hero caresses a mirror, unwilling to admit he will never see his own reflection again. This incident vividly portrayed the severe emotional shock that accompanies blindness. For almost every newly blinded individual, a period of incredible depression follows the loss of sight. Some people tell themselves their condition is only temporary, that soon some medical breakthrough or religious miracle will restore their lost vision. Others become withdrawn, silently cursing their fate and refusing to restore any semblance of a normal life. A few individuals seem to actually enjoy being dependent on others and expect those around them to be available constantly to meet the every need of the poor, pitiful blind person. From my work in the STAND program, I knew the psychological impact of blindness and wanted desperately to be able to meet this need in our work at the center. By coincidence, soon after I started my search for a staff psychologist, a friend of mine who worked as a rehabilitation counselor in Michigan called me and recommended a young man who had just graduated with a master's degree in guidance and counseling from the University of Michigan. My friend told me he was having a difficult time finding a job for the young man because of blindness and inexperience. The counselor asked me if I would hire Lyle Thum, the blind psychologist, on an internship basis, which I enthusiastically agreed to do. The first 3 months, the Michigan Rehabilitation Program paid us while Lyle oriented himself to our program, and after that he went on our payroll, where he remained for 13 years. Lyle made an important contribution to our program, administering and evaluating aptitude, IQ, and other tests, counseling, with the trainees and serving as a role model of a successful blind person by doing numerous things our trainees thought were limited to sighted individuals. For example, he was the first blind person I ever encountered who knew how to water ski. One weekend, Bernice and I accompanied Lyle on a skiing trip to Hot Springs, where he demonstrated tremendous skill and confidence as he jumped the waves and swung in a wide arc behind the boat. Unfortunately, he somehow missed a wave and flipped over. As a child, Lyle had suffered from congenital glaucoma and had to have his eyes removed and artificial eyes inserted. When he hit the water that afternoon, the blow knocked out one of his prostheses. He had a marvelous sense of humor, and when he got to shore, he laughed about the accident and told us he would have to run an advertisement in the Hot Springs newspaper informing the local fishermen that if they caught a fish and cut it open and it's still looking at you, the eye belongs to Lyle Thum. When Lyle started our counseling program at the center, Dr. Peyton Kolb continued this facet of our training and expanded the service to a high professional level. Upon his return from the Korean War, Dr. Kolb volunteered his services to the AEB as a psychiatric consultant. He visited the center every Saturday morning, talking with the trainees and advising those who had unusual emotional problems. Dr. Kolb had no special training in working with the blind, but he read the limited literature that existed in those days and over the years became self-trained on the subject, often presenting papers on blindness and mental health at national psychiatric meetings. In 1958, Dr. Kolb began meeting with our staff and expanding his time with the trainees who needed his services. He has remained a part-time staff member at the center for over 25 years and provided valuable insights for staff members and trainees alike. He often explained that mental illness is just like physical illness, and a person can recover from emotional problems just as well as from physical ones. This concept helped all of us in dealing with some of our trainees who seemed mired forever in a deep pit of depression. I will always be grateful to Dr. Kolb for providing the important and needed dimension of psychiatric counseling for our rehabilitation center. All of our staff members, Lila Lumpkin, Oliver Burke, Lyle Thum, Dr. Kolb, and so many others, added their personal touch to the rehabilitation center. Over the years, each of these individuals made a special contribution to the development of the facility, and they will always be remembered for their conscientious and devoted service. As executive director of the center, my job in this formative era centered primarily on promotion and education. Raising money took a considerable amount of time, as did my efforts to sell blind people on what the center could do for them. In this regard, my work resembled my earlier job with the STAND program, convincing blind people they could live useful and productive lives and letting them know how the rehabilitation center could help them reach their goals. Finally, I had to convince the rehabilitation professionals that they should invest their funds on the services offered by the center. Without their referrals, our program would never have reached the thousands of blind people who eventually received the training we provided. A secondary selling job that I undertook during those years involved educating the general public about blindness and trying to shatter some of the persistent myths that surround the loss of sight. Far too often I heard well-meaning people say how fortunate it was that when a person lost his vision, he was compensated with a corresponding improvement in his capacity to hear. These myths never cease to amaze me in the degree to which the public accepts them without ever bothering to investigate their validity. In an effort to confront these misconceptions and to sell our program at the center, I traveled thousands of miles to speak to Lions clubs and other civic groups throughout Arkansas and the surrounding states. Whenever possible, I took Lyle Toom, Oliver Burke, or one of our trainees with me to help explain our program. One of the most popular presentations was a panel discussion called Learning to Live Without Sight, which we began in 1955 and presented to various organizations for many years thereafter. Unquestionably, the most effective method of telling our story was a series of films made at the center starting in the mid-50s. Our first movie, entitled Living Without Sight, was written by George S. Brewer and produced by the Lions Club. Although my debut as movie director never won acclaim in Hollywood, I thought Living Without Sight served the purpose well by demonstrating the nature of the program at the center, showing scenes of the Brack home and informing the public of the important role the Lions Club played in creating the facility. Our second color movie, Pathways to a New Life, premiered in October 1964 at the Site Conservation Forum. The film showed our new building and focused on experiences of 3 trainees who had benefited from their training at the center. We financed the movie by selling Miss America license tags in honor of Donna Axum of El Dorado, Arkansas, the 1964 Miss America. In 1971, we released Happiness is a State of Mind, a 22-minute film on the operation and philosophy of the Arkansas Enterprises for the Blind. Under a $16,000 grant from the Jess Odom Foundation, the movie included a narration by cowboy movie star Roy Rogers. 2 years after its release, Happiness is a State of Mind had been seen in 33 states and some Latin American countries by rehabilitation personnel, Lions clubs, and other civic groups, as well as by hundreds of concerned individuals. Another important instrument that has helped publicize the work of the center has been our monthly newsletter, published continuously since 1954. About a year after we started the newsletter, Mrs. Elizabeth Oots of Kansas City, Missouri, completed her instruction at the center and, in a brief farewell speech, made the remark that here the foundations have been laid upon which I can build a new life. From that time on, we adopted the title New Life for our newsletter. Each month, Lions throughout the country, former trainees, and other interested people receive the latest issue of New Life, which contains articles on innovative programs at the center, personnel changes, and news of the achievements of our graduates. New Life has been an important vehicle in publicizing the work of the center and selling what we believe is the finest rehabilitation program for the adult blind in the world. Arkansas's fortunes have not always included such institutions. In 1939, the state ranked 48th in its work for the blind. 20 years later, however, Arkansas ranked near the top of the field. The Rehabilitation Center in Little Rock made an important contribution to this dramatic rise, as did the Arkansas School for the Blind and the state's Vocational Rehabilitation Department. One important aspect of this climb involved an early effort on the part of many people to aid all of the blind citizens of the state, regardless of social class or race. For example, starting in the mid-1940s, the AEB initiated a concerted effort to recruit black operators for the STAND program. This campaign proved to be one of the most difficult tasks I ever attempted. Because of the racial prejudice of Southern whites, blacks always had difficulty finding meaningful work, and if the black person happened to be blind, finding a job was almost impossible. After many futile efforts with public and private organizations, I convinced Dr. Lawrence Davis, the president of the state's all-black college, Arkansas A&M, to allow us to establish a stand on the school campus at Pine Bluff. On December 4th, 1946, a part-time preacher named Charles Johnson became our first black stand operator. Several years later, Chris Finkbinder of the Little Rock Packing Company allowed us to open a stand with a black operator in his plant. And by the early 1950s, we had 4 black operators in the program. Despite the southern mores of the era, whenever we had sales meetings or general gatherings of our operators, everyone sat wherever they wanted. I think in many ways white blind people were more sympathetic than their sighted counterparts to the plight of American blacks, because they also had experienced discrimination. Reluctantly, we did yield on the segregation issue in establishing a separate rehabilitation center for blind black adults. Because of my earlier success in Pine Bluff, I worked closely with the black community in that city to create a facility similar to the one in Little Rock. During an organizational meeting in the summer of 1951, Viola Lee, a retired school teacher, volunteered to donate her house to serve as an adjustment center. She became the first supervisor of the facility, and we named the operation the Cohen Center in honor of her parents. We launched a fundraising drive under the auspices of the Pine Bluff Lions Club that resembled our efforts 4 years earlier in Little Rock. The highlight of the campaign for the Cohen Center, however, was a wonderful benefit concert by the famous composer of the St. Louis Blues, W.C. Handy. Handy, who had lost his sight some years earlier, headed the Handy Foundation for the Blind, and his generous support for our project helped establish the Cohen Center on a firm financial basis. Even with the Cohen Center in Pine Bluff, we faced the ugly specter of racial prejudice at our facility in Little Rock. Although we had trained a black person at the center before the city's 1957 racial controversy, during the crisis we accepted a blind woman from Guam who had a dark complexion, and immediately after she began her mobility training in the neighborhood, our switchboard lit up with a rash of hate calls. "Are you trying to integrate over there?" an angry caller shouted at me. "We're not going to have Negroes in this neighborhood, even if they are blind." The strangest phenomenon in the whole incident was that after I explained that the individual in question was a native of Guam and not a fellow citizen of the United States, the callers backed away from their opposition. In the early 1960s, after the AEB board phased out the Cohen Center, I invited Anthony Celebres, President John Kennedy's new Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, to speak at the dedication of one of our new buildings. Celebres's assistant phoned me and asked if the dedication would be integrated. Although I assured him that this would be the case, he felt that because of Little Rock's reputation in racial matters, an insufficient number of blacks in the audience would be embarrassing to the secretary. I phoned Mary Switzer, the head of the Federal Rehabilitation Program in Washington, and she had the answer. She suggested we invite instead Louis Rives, the chief of the Federal Office for the Blind, who was blind himself. "He's familiar with your program down there," Mary said, "and besides, he won't see whether it's integrated or not." From the day we admitted our first trainee in 1947, the people associated with the Adjustment Center began building the foundations that sustained the program for over 30 years. Our basic services, orientation and mobility, daily living techniques, communication skills, recreational activities, and psychosocial and vocational evaluations remained the core of our services. Staff members like Lala Lampkin, Oliver Burke, and Lyle Toom, and Peyton Kolb began a tradition of dedicated service in those early days. But the key ingredient in making our program a success was a unique group of blind people who came to the center to learn how to live a meaningful existence and build a new life. These were the individuals who bore the lion's share of making the center a special kind of place.